Good morning. See how many get washed away today. If you think this bad, just wait a couple of days. We're going to have a ski party. We're starting a look today at the four Gospels and the Guess what? Yes, did I not put one in your sheet? Oh, well. Cheap help to get nowadays. There's some pretty basic things, of course, that ought to always be kept in mind about the Gospels. Get everybody in one pass. There's some rather basic things that we always remember about the Gospels. No coughing.
That's right.
Come on, Sheila. By the way, might as well pick on Sheila a while. You realize what the Australian word for girl is? Sheila. All women are Sheilas. So, the other hand, don't worry about Australians. Aussies are not the brightest people in the world anyway. So, if you don't believe that, just ask any New Zealander. We watched a little commercial last night. A gentleman in New Zealand writing about how to be a dad, and he was talking about. Most people have had pot pies, we call them in this country. Those little meat pies are not unique to frozen foods in the U.S. That is standard working man's sandwich, lunch, in most of the English world. And every little corner stand that sells any kind of groceries, like 7-Eleven type of things. They're usually mom and pop stands, and there's a constant rivalry about who makes the best ones. And they put all kinds of fillings in there. And this man was giving a proper way. He repeated himself a couple of times, said, be sure and not eat your pie like an Aussie, whatever you do. So if you ever hear somebody from Australia brag about how well they play cricket or rugby, just remind them that New Zealand regularly beats them. It's just not really a competition at all anymore. They've lost at rugby for something like 12, 15 years straight to New Zealand. So they win one game in 5 or 6 years, and they carry on like they'd actually done something big. So it doesn't really mean much to be in Australia. An Aussie is and the funny thing about it is, of course, in the church, We knew several congregations and members of the church in Australia, and that kind of playing off of each other is always fun, but it's a constant reminder that God's family transcends all those borders. One Australian congregation that I know of was going through and trying to, they had a couple of composers in the congregation, and they were going through and taking the book of Psalms and taking every single psalm and setting it to music to be sung, so it could be sung. And just a great project, but you still want to pick on them. You know how it is. It's kind of like, your brothers and sisters growing up. You may love them, but you still have to remind them that they're lower status than you are. The Gospels, the 4 Gospels. I guess that should have been the first question. How many Gospels are there? 4. Yes.
There's one gospel.
There's one gospel. And that's a great point to realize that these 4 books that we think of as the story of Jesus' life are really more in the line of what we would think of as a family album, snapshots. If one family member, my brother has photo albums of my mother and others from over the years, do all of their pictures look exactly like mine do in the albums that I've kept? No, nobody expects them to. Certain pictures are more meaningful to one person than the other. I don't have that many pictures of my brother. I know what he looks like. I don't need another picture of him. On the other hand, my grandkids is a different subject. I need lots of pictures of them. So priorities of what you're thinking about or writing about, and those linkages are always important. Now, think about it. The 4 Gospels written to Christians, but initially planned for different groups, 4 different groups of Christians or non-Christians. So why wouldn't they have different snapshots? We often talk about the first 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as, big fancy technical term. Anybody know what that is?
Synoptic.
The synoptics. Big fancy word. You know what synoptics mean? Seen together. Common view. Whoa. So why don't you just say that? Okay, you just say that. The first 3 Gospels present a common view of Jesus. How common? Well, much of the material of those 3 Gospels is found in each one of them, or at least allusions to it. And so you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and you think, okay, Mark reads like the Reader's Digest condensed. Boy, anybody remember Reader's Digest condensed books?
Oh, yes.
Y'all are old. I've only heard about it from a librarian, so... Reader's Digest condensed book. That's the book of Mark. It is intended to very much to be a quick picture of the story of Jesus that gets across to a particular audience. In the case of Mark, it is focused very much on the Roman people. They didn't have time, especially for, how many gods did the Romans have?
Lots.
Yeah, that's the best answer I've ever found. Lots. The Romans had an entire pantheon of gods before they conquered the Greeks, and they immediately took all the Greek gods and incorporated them and just gave them different names. We run into that a lot. Anybody remember who the king of the gods was in Greek mythology? Zeus. Zeus is the king of the gods, him and his big thunderbolt, and he rules over the other gods, and and is in charge of everything. When the Romans took him over, they called him Jupiter. That's where we get the name of planets. The planet Jupiter is named after the Zeus. But the Romans weren't going to call their new god that they had adopted, and he's kind of top of the pantheon there of gods, at least in that group of gods, but they had lots of other gods that they worshiped, some more. And you know who the most important god of all to the Romans in the New Testament world was? The emperor. The emperor. The cult of the emperor, worshiping whoever was Caesar, was always a thing in the Roman Empire in the first, second, and later centuries. That so important that becomes the real focus of persecution against Christians. If you will not worship the emperor and make offerings to him, then you're destined to die. And that was exactly the sentence that was pronounced on Christians for a couple, 3 centuries there. We knew that they were fake. We knew that they were irreligious, and what's more, they're terrorists. They're people worshiping a strange god and coming into our country, and they deserve to die. So, by the way, you notice that a lot of that attitude still goes on in our world today. We have people come into our country, and one drove through the streets of down in Louisiana, through New Orleans, killing as many people as he could. Why? Because his God demanded that you kill all the people that don't believe in his God. It gets even more hilarious when you find out that his particular group kills other Muslims because they don't go along with their brand of Muslim philosophy. If you see any similarities to Catholicism and the idea that anyone that doesn't agree with us must die, yeah, it's just the same. People have claimed to be followers of Christ for ever, since the time of Christ. And some of them have completely wrong ideas. What's our job? What is our job as Christians? To teach others.
The truth.
To teach others the truth. Doesn't do any good. Doesn't mean anything. I mean, can you imagine going to school to learn how to drive and get your driver's license to somebody like me? Yeah, I think a left turn on red is perfectly acceptable. In fact, a red light means go. You remember that. Green means go, yellow means go real fast, and red means, whoo, floorboarded, so you can get through. I don't really need that as your driving instructor, do you? Not going to be helpful. So the 4 Gospels very much present a picture that is important initially to other people, to certain groups of people. Mark focuses on the Roman attitude of let's get her there and get her done and immediately tell me what's different about Jesus from any of the other gods. Matthew, on the other hand, who's Matthew written to? Primarily, initially.
Jews.
The Jewish people. You will see that, and we'll go through some of the things. Very first on the list down there, notes and unique features about Matthew. He's going to follow pretty much the same chronology of events as Mark. Doesn't always agree with Luke. Why? One of the hardest things that you will ever do is try to sort out what is the exact chronology of events in Jesus' life. Why? Grab out your family photo album. Have you ever noticed that sometimes it's hard to put things? Oh yeah, when the kids are little bitty, they can be put in chronology. Yeah, little bitty kids go first here. The kids grown up go there. But what about when you got 5 or 6 or 10 or 12 pictures of them looking about the same age? Which one came at the beginning of vacation and which one at the end of vacation? That's a little harder to tell sometimes, isn't it? It's obvious each of the Gospels end with what significant event? How did each of the Gospels end? Okay, the death, the burial, and resurrection of Jesus. That's always the focus. Is that really important? That's exactly how Paul explains to the Corinthians that Christ died, was buried, and raised again the third day. That is the focus of. That's what makes the story of Jesus different than any other religious story. Do you know how many gods have died in the Roman and Greek pantheons? Lots of them. In fact, there's a whole list of Greek gods that came before the Olympic gods. Anybody remember their names? Who? Okay, the Titans. They were from Tennessee and played football, right? The has-beens. And they're deposed, they're gone. If you're a Rick Riordan fan, there's books about them coming back and then getting killed again and deposed again. But dead gods are forgotten. How many people today do you suppose worship the Roman gods from Mount Olympia?
I'm sure there's a few out there.
Oh, I'm sure there's a few nuts out there. There always are. Most of them are modern day people that have said, I've read a couple of stories about that and I think that's really neat, and they don't even get half their stories right. It kind of gets hilarious when somebody announces, there was a group a couple of years ago in Europe announced that they were going to, they worship the gods of Mount Olympus. Okay. And they explained some different things about them and who they were and what they did. And, somebody failed their Greek course. That doesn't describe really who they were. We've changed them. Do people invent their own gods?
All the time.
All the time. All the time. New Testament warns us about worshiping anyone or anything other than the Lord. And that really becomes funny when you incorporate and read the Old Testament. Do you realize how many things that people worshiped other than God? I mean, they had trees. That's a special tree. Well, is it the tree in my yard or your yard that's the holy tree? Well, at my house, it's the one in my yard. At your house, no, that's just not right. You're worshiping the wrong God. They had a million different gods. What's the word for hell that Jesus uses?
Gehenna.
Gehenna. Gehenna. Do you know what it comes from? That was the city dump in New Testament times. Outside, anybody ever see a dump fire?
Had one in South Carolina a year or so ago that I don't know whether they could ever put it out.
And you can't ever put them out. You bring in truckloads of water and dump it on that dump, and they bring in bulldozers and cover it up, and you know what happens? The next time somebody drives a bulldozer through that area, it flares right back up. You see Jesus' comment about hell, Gehenna, and the fire that burns forever, can't be put out. And here's one. What does a dump smell like?
Roses.
Yeah, that's, the whole picture is a disgusting place that, how many people want to go build their house out next to the dump? No. Everything about it is disgusting. And that was Jesus' point. Says, here is what hell is like. Here's how to understand where you're going to spend eternity. Talk about a bad neighborhood. That's it. And what kind of neighbors do you get there, too? Not a pretty picture at all.
Rats and vermin.
All the vermin. Yeah, pleasant neighbors. Might as well have a river when it floods, huh? Told you we were going to pick on you today. So, the hard part of telling the story of Jesus requires us to understand where people are. If you don't start there, it's always going to be much harder to really, take a child that has never been to school before. You start them in 12th grade. How well will they do? Very intelligent child. They know how to learn. They're eager to learn. They're wonderful people. But if you start them in someplace beyond what they know, then what's the point? What's the point? The same thing is true of the gospel. Understand when you're trying to teach someone where they're at. Anybody remember the old Jewel Miller film strip series? Anybody that remembers that is really old. That's from the 50s. That's ancient. The reality is that the reality is that the Jewel Miller series was intended for people that had no real background in the Bible at all. And there are 2 or 3 other more modern series. The Jewel Miller, by the way, has just been updated. Know some of the people, acquainted with some of the people that were involved in that. They've tried to go through and update everything as much as possible. Modern pictures. It's kind of hard to show somebody pictures of somebody from the 50s. You feel like you're watching old TV programs, huh? So people wearing modern clothes and looks a little bit less like a 1950s TV show. Father Knows Best or something. Those of you that smile at that are really old, if you remember that one. So the reality of teaching people where they are means that the tools that you use, some are going to be better than others. If you have someone that has no knowledge of the Bible at all, should you just jump in immediately with 1 Timothy? Romans? Let me tell you, let's go to Romans 6 and talk about baptism. Baptism, what's that? Why? What's the meaning of it? Bad place to start. So each of these 4 Gospels gives us a different starting place. For people that have some knowledge of the Old Testament, Matthew is great. He's going to constantly be saying things like, this was a fulfillment of the prophet or of the Old Testament. By the way, who are the prophets?
You're talking about the ones in the Old Testament? Matthew cites?
Yeah, we think about, those books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel. I don't remember who Lamentations was as a prophet, but I'm sure he was one of the prophets, right? But you get past the poetic books, and those are all the books of the prophets. Was David a prophet? Absolutely. He's even called a prophet.
In a sense, all the patriarchs were prophets.
Was Abraham a prophet?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, absolutely. Was Noah a prophet?
Yes.
Who of those that were faithful in the Old Testament were not? Important reminder. What is a prophet? There's two distinct definitions of someone. Prophecy can be foretelling the future. And many of those Old Testament prophets, David foretold the future, the coming of the Savior, and what he would be like, and that he would be like. Was Moses a prophet? One of the last things that Moses said to the people was that one day there would come another prophet like him that they should listen to in all things. Who was he talking about? The ultimate prophet coming, Jesus. The second meaning of prophecy is not foretelling the future, but forthtelling. In fact, if you go back and read most of the major and minor prophets, most of the time what they spent their time doing was telling people what God had already said. They knew what God had said. And they simply told them, says, this is your last chance. Do what you're told. You ever think about it as a parent? Are you a prophet? If I've told you once, I've told you how many times? Thousands, millions, billions. We just get bigger numbers every time we tell them, don't we? And rightly so. Are you also a prophet when you tell them that, hey, that's the last time I'm going to tell you, and you mean it? Ooh, always hated to hear that one. My brother was the dumb one. He'd pop up and say, well, okay, you said that last time, and I got away with it again. And of course that got him an extra beating, so like I said, he was never the brightest one. I was at least smart enough to keep my mouth shut. Don't remind them, whatever you do, that they've already said that once before. But telling the future, what's going to happen, is prophecy. Telling what's already happened that's important to someone is also prophecy. Foretelling and forthtelling. And the prophets frequently simply were called to. So, this is a kind of a trick question. We hear a lot from the denominational world. Are there any prophets in the church today? Okay. In one sense, God's people are called to, 1 Peter, tell others of Jesus. If we're not doing that, then we're really not Christians, are we? That's the very reason Peter says that you are called for this purpose. Kind of strange, and Lou and I were talking about this one the other day. In our world today, how many people take selfies? Just have a look on any kind of social media, and everybody has self. And let me be an old person for a moment. Why is it that everyone goes into the bathroom and takes a picture of themselves as a selfie? Honestly, I mean, we need to start making fun of that. That's ridiculous. Oh, no, that's what all my friends do. Okay, parents, what's the answer to that when your children tell you, all my friends do that? Exactly. Everybody goes to parent school, don't they? Before your first child is born, you have to go to school and memorize these. If all your friends jumped off a cliff, would you do it too? And we use that all the time, don't we, as parents? Admit it, old people. You remember what you learned in that special class. The reality is, telling people is important. It's vital to us as Christians. If it's important to parents, how much more so to us that are children of God? Well, when would you use the Gospel of Matthew? Anytime that you'd use, is it any use at all? With all those links to the Old Testament, fulfillment of prophecy?
Well, number one, it establishes the credibility of the Bible itself. When someone questions whether or not the Bible is true, one of the criteria would be fulfilled prophecy.
Okay. By the way, there are some great discussions about how many prophecies are actually fulfilled by Jesus in the New Testament. They number in the hundreds easily. And there are great discussions about how many thousands of prophecies technical, nitpicky detail of things said in the Old Testament are fulfilled by Jesus. I know of at least one mathematician that figured up what are the chances that any one person in the world would fulfill all of those Old Testament prophecies. And it's in ridiculously large numbers area. There's just billions and billions of chances that they would miss one of the important ones, one of the big ones. And if he fulfills them all, then that says something about it, that link. You can't deal with people that know the Bible to some extent without also getting into the rest of the story, where all this comes from. So Matthew is a great gospel if you have someone that actually has some acquaintance with the Old Testament. Now, are there any people in our world that know some things from the Old Testament? A lot of them.
Absolutely.
Has anybody noticed how many people are in favor of, try this one on for size, we should have the 10 Commandments published in our schools? And they do that with a straight face, telling people that that's because I'm a good Christian. Paul said those commandments were taken out of the way and nailed to the cross. So we don't have to do any of those, right? Well, that's a little harder. But as the 10 Commandments, are we under the 10 Commandments? No. We're not. That does not mean the same thing as, let's have a party because we can now break all those commandments. That's not the same thing, because the New Testament is going to reestablish many of those and extend them. The Jews had, for example, honor your father and mother, one of the 10 Commandments. They had taken that to the extreme that, hey, if I tell my mother and dad that I'm going to use all this money for something for God, then I don't have to care for them. That's what Jesus is talking about when he says, and they called it Korban. They said that it was dedicated to God. They didn't actually give it away. They simply kept it to use for themselves. But say, hey, after all, if I buy a new car, a new BMW, solid gold, Rolls Royce, I'm using that for God.
Gulfstream.
Yeah, get me a brand new jet. That's for God. So I don't have to use that money that God, or that time or effort that God expected me to use for caring for my parents. Jesus says, you've just twisted those commandments to make something out of them that's not there. Instead, he talks about responsibility. Isn't that harder? Responsibility harder than just isn't it nice having a nice flat out list that you can look at and say, yep, I did that, check it off. Nope, I didn't do that, but I'll do it tomorrow. No problem. Lists are nice and convenient. Okay, what grade level do you do lists for? How many lists do you get like that in college? Not really. They talk more about making you understand principles about things and understanding how to work things out instead of just, okay, do this, do that. It's one thing with addition and subtraction. You add this number, you add that number. You can take your shoes off and you can count on your fingers and toes to get those numbers. But when they get into, oh boy, here you go, Jeremy. Square root of I. The square root of an imaginary number. You can't do that. Well, actually you can, and you have to a lot. But you have to have that basic concept and go on way beyond that to understand what that even is talking about. Isn't the same thing true of God's Word? God gives basic concepts in the Old Testament, but the whole purpose is to go on to something mature. God actually uses those words, doesn't he? And the challenge of the New Testament to press on towards maturity. Understanding what we do, why we do it. Matthew, Gospel of the Messiah. Mark, Gospel basically for the Roman people, the Greek people, the people that want it quick, the Reader's Digest condensed version. So why do we need Luke? What's Luke going to do for us?
Ties it all together.
Okay. Luke's going to kind of tie together a lot of the things from Matthew and Mark.
And he's teaching to Gentiles that have no background in the Bible.
Okay. Luke begins, and by the way, Matthew will surprise you with his links to the Gentiles. It shouldn't. Go back and look at Old Testament passages that remind us. God has always told the people of the Old Testament world that he was going to bring in the Gentiles, that everyone was to be reached out to for salvation. They just didn't want to believe it. Kind of sound like us sometimes. I don't want to believe that. I don't care how many times you've told me. I'm not going to do it. Well, then you're going to get in trouble. Luke tends to tie that together and add even more of Jesus' ministry to the Gentiles. Why doesn't Mark make a big production of the Gentile world? Because he's writing basically the story of God for everybody. He's more interested in the basics of here's what Jesus said. But Matthew and Luke are trying to say, here are the people that are involved. Matthew may focus primarily on the Jewish people, but he reminds them repeatedly that God's always said the others are going to be brought. Luke does character studies. Now, why on earth would Luke be involved with individual people like that? What was Luke's job? He's a doctor. One of the hilarious things about doctors, have you ever found a doctor that had a good bedside manner? We all remember the ones with the bad bedside manner. I don't like people. I don't like you. Here's my diagnosis. You can take it or leave it. And then the one that sits down and talks with you and listens. Which one are you going to go to? It's not hard, is it? And Luke presents a picture of Jesus, in a sense, a universal picture of Jesus for everybody. If you have people that come up with a wild story, have you heard anybody come up with a wild story in our world today that the Bible hates women? The Apostle Paul especially is frequently accused by commentators of, Paul hated women. So you don't have to listen to anything that Paul says. Just go on to somebody else that never mentions anything about women. You know, that fits our world today to a T, doesn't it? I mean, there are no men and women. You can just call yourself anything you want. Okay. That went downhill in a hurry, didn't it, in our world? It's hilarious that people are running around actively, openly doing things and saying things, believing things that 20 years ago they would have been thrown in jail for.
Or a mental institution.
Or a mental institution, or both. Jerry?
I was going to ask, I think the general impression of Paul hating women pretty much comes from a very difficult series of passages in Corinthians, right?
Well, of course.
Yeah.
And you very carefully pay attention to only what you want to pay attention to. And isn't it hilarious? Are there any things that women can do that men can't? Remember the old joke? If men could have babies, the woman would have the first one, the husband would have the second one, the wife would have the third one, and there would never be anybody with 4 children in the family. Never going to happen again. And by the way, for men, you do realize that a man with a cold knows more about labor in a woman. It's far worse. We laugh about things like that, and yet Luke presents the perfect picture of Jesus' interest in caring for everyone. There are more character studies of the women that Jesus touches in his life in Luke's gospel than anywhere else. He cares about everyone. And Luke also includes even men and women that are not Jewish. And Jesus interacts with them. Well, that leaves us one gospel to figure out, and we're going to go back through some of the details here. You can have a read. See where we're going with this. But what happens in John? Well, I don't know. We're out of time. We'll have to figure that out next time.